subjects act and objects are acted upon. So even if you are the most valuable sex object in a culture that tells little girls that is what our value is, even if you're the most valuable sex object, you're still in a position that is inferior or subordinate to sexual subjects. Men get to be sexual subjects. They get to be the choosers, the validators of other men, the validators of women and their worth. And when you think about how we validate men, we raise them to view their bodies as these tools to master their environment, as Sarah Mernon put it, whereas we raise little girls to view their bodies as these projects that are never done, that are never good enough, and constantly
This
have to
is
be worked on.
Unconditioning, discovering the voice within, with Whitney Ann Jenkins. Hello and welcome to the 63rd episode of Unconditioning, Discovering the Voice Within, where I bring on guests and we talk about the inner authentic voice and the challenges and the rewards that come from following it. This week I have with me Dr. Caroline Heldman. Caroline is a political scientist and a chair of the Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies program at Occidental College in Los Angeles. She's also the executive director of the Representation Project and a political commentator for Spectrum and CNN International. Dr. Heldman has published 7 books on gender justice and politics, and her work has been featured in numerous documentaries, including Misrepresentation and The Mask You Live In. She co-founded the New Orleans Women's Shelter, the Lower Ninth Ward Living Museum, End Rape on Campus, EROC, Faculty Against Rape, and led the End Rape Statute of Limitations that successfully abolished the time limit on prosecuting rape in California. She is the board president of TEP Center, the first civil rights museum in New Orleans, and she's the chair of the Board of Alturas Institute, a nonprofit fighting for stronger democracy. She also just released a book called The Sexy Lie, which we talk about, as well as many other issues that are currently happening in our society with an angle from her perspective and wisdom of studying these subjects for many years. I had a wonderful time speaking with Dr. Caroline Heldman, and I know that you are going to gain a lot from her wisdom too. So here she is. You have a very specific passion and theme within your work. And in order for you to be able to be the thought leader that you are on all these subjects, you had to go through a lot of things yourself in your own life, I believe, to be able to guide others. So what was it that brought you to want to be the leader in your life?
I would say that my interest in feminism was really piqued by my sexist father, who he passed away a decade ago and had quite a shift at the end of his life. But I grew up in a household with 1 brother and 5 sisters, and the girls were not allowed to cut their hair or wear pants. My father would often say that he doesn't listen to chick musicians. He doesn't read, chick books or literature. And so the sexism was pretty palpable in my household. And I always thought it was strange that my brother was allowed to do things that none of the sisters were allowed to do. And I was also raised Pentecostal evangelical. So for folks who don't know what that religion is, we do believe that Jesus, that there's going to be a return to earth, that there's going to be essentially people who follow the very specific teachings of that religion are going to go to heaven, and everybody else is going to be left on earth, and it's going to be absolutely horrible for those who are left on earth. And so I grew up with a lot of fear around being left behind. In fact, there was even a series called Left Behind, a series of films, and I saw them as a young child. And I remember, not to get too graphic, but being so terrified that, bedwetting was a thing after those films. It was that terrifying because I believed that this was pretty imminent. And so constantly fearing that I was going to be left behind and all of my family members were going to be taken to heaven. Also not allowed to do much in church, right? Being told that women shouldn't speak. So the only time we were speaking in church was singing or leading song service. So that was allowed. And so I grew up in what I would call a very gender repressive household. And when a friend of the family slipped me a book as a tween, the book was The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. It was mind-blowing. I had no idea that, women could be thought of as full human beings. I had no concept that women could be in spaces where they were the masters of their own destiny. And so it was very eye-opening. And I started actually kind of covertly sharing this information with people in my Sunday school class. I should also point out that I was homeschooled as a child because my parents were worried about the very worldly influences I might encounter. And so it really was kind of a closed loop. I should also mention that we didn't have a television set. There was a neighbor's television set that sometimes we would wheel over once every few years when Roots came on. Oddly enough, my parents were hyper conservative and religious and also cared deeply about racial justice. And so it was this odd combination of conservatism and kind of a liberal notion that at least when it came to race, not gender, but at least when it came to race, we needed to be compassionate and inclusive. And as much as I'm very critical of my father, and as much as I have moved away from the church and I'm now a pretty hardcore atheist, his kind of edict or his drive was a Bible verse, right? That if, as Jesus said, if you have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me. In other words, you need to be serving people who are the most vulnerable, who are the most threatened in society. And so I think that his approach to that is definitely something I use now in my social justice work, although I will say, not in a way that my dad necessarily would endorse or ever has endorsed.
Wow, yeah. So your connection to the outside world was very limited, and you were set up with all of these boundaries surrounding you. And that book seemed to be what propelled you to sort of have a different perspective that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Absolutely, Whitney Ann. And it was this moment too where I realized, as someone who liked to write short stories, mostly revolving around my cats or Sasquatch, who I was constantly looking for, because I was told she was real. So, that was my passion as a child, was cats and Sasquatch. I did a lot of writing, but then I realized when reading The Feminine Mystique that words could change the world. It literally changed my world. And I understood that whatever life path I was going to be following, I was going to be using words to bring about social change. And so I guess it's not too surprising that I'm a professor with, I have written a lot of books and trying to do precisely that.
Absolutely. So you said that you have sisters. Were you able to share this book with them as well?
Yes and no. So there were certain sisters I knew were going to, rat me out. And so my sister Kathleen, certainly the sister that was closest in age. So she and I both kind of had this feminist awakening as tweens and staged a few runaway from home events, which didn't get very far and ended up, getting us into a lot of trouble. But by and large, most of my family is still back in the small town of Yakult, Washington. It was a town of 500 when I was there, and I think it's pushing around 1,000 residents now.
Yeah. So this inner drive drove you in your inner voice, your authenticity that you were connected to by reading this book, to leave that town at some point. So what was the thing that allowed you to do that?
Well, Whitney, I'm critical a bit of homeschooling, but I will say one thing that it did do was accelerate my learning. Public education is paced at the lower end or the slower end of the classroom for obvious reasons. As an educator, I understand that you can't leave folks behind. But what that means is that you can move probably more quickly. I'm really critical of homeschooling because when it's done in order to maintain an ideological barrier around your child, I think it can be pretty harmful. But I will say that homeschooling allowed me to graduate from high school early and go to college early. And I was a young teenager. And as soon as I finished up my BA in business administration, I hopped on a plane, still a teenager, hopped on a plane to Washington, D.C. to work for Jolene Unsold, the 3rd District of Washington State. And this was my first trip away from Yakult, Washington. So I landed in Washington, D.C. and saw my first day there, the biggest rat I had ever seen. And I'm a huge animal lover. And it doesn't matter how big the rat is, I'm going to love that rat. But I thought it was a dog. And of course, I'm trying to pet it and it's running away from me. So I had, this hillbilly teen in DC experiences. And it was just an incredible awakening working as a legislative correspondent in Congress, and then applying for my PhD and going up to Rutgers. It was the only women in politics PhD program in the world at the time. So it was certainly a radical shift in my worldview, moving to the East Coast and these big cities, having come from Yakult, Washington.
Absolutely. From Washington to Washington.
Yep.
Excellent. So in your PhD studies, what was your focus specifically?
My focus was on, gender and politics, but I also am a quantitative methodologist. So it was a combination of being a data scientist and a gender theorist, which is, I'm going to say in academia, pretty unusual, but beneficial for kind of getting a deep understanding of the mechanisms of how something works, and then a better understanding of how it's actually functioning today using data. So I'm putting myself to sleep describing what I worked on, what I actually worked on, what my real passion, the stories and the data stories I was digging into had to do with consumer activism and how we've used boycotting, socially conscious investing, direct consumer protests, the Boston Tea Party on using the marketplace to advance political concerns. And specifically, I started off with a focus on women and how women have uniquely used consumer activism, because even before we got the vote, when we're not allowed in the halls of power formally, we flexed our economic muscle in political ways. And then I broadened it to look at how it's been used by racially marginalized groups. So essentially, any group that's been marginalized over time has used marketplace channels when they lack political power. And so that was my dissertation, which I later published as a book, I think 20 years later, as a book. And I'm a political scientist, but I will say that my academic career has moved very far away from my original position. I am currently in the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice, which is a more theory-based department. It's odd for a data scientist to be in that department, but it fits because I do a lot of social justice work. And I've really broadened my focus to look at systems of power, so gender, race, ability, sexuality, body size, and age. So I look at ageism, I look at fat phobia, I look at transphobia, I look at racism, I look at how these systems are very similar in how they maintain themselves in terms of bias. So if you know about sexism, you actually know quite a bit about racism. If you know about racism, you actually know quite a bit about the mechanisms of fat phobia, because all of these systems are put in place to maintain an existing social order that benefits certain people. So when you understand that, you start to see the patterns, whether it's stigmatization, whether it's stereotyping, whether it's regressive laws that reflect stigmatization and stereotyping. And so I focus, a lot of my work is obviously focused on women, but it's always through an intersectional lens, meaning it's women who are also otherwise marginalized. So I'm focusing on women of color, right? On Black women, on South Asian women, on Native American women. I'm focused on Latin women. I'm focused on, Japanese American women and their representations in popular cinema, whether I'm looking at politics or media. I'm focusing on, for example, how fat women are represented. And I should say, fat is not an insult. We're reclaiming that term, right? It is simply a descriptive term. I'm, really pushing hard. I think that's the next kind of front in terms of social justice, focusing on fat phobia as a social justice issue, given the fact that that about 80% of our body size is determined by our genetics, also by the fact that 95% of diets fail. So this notion that somehow our body size is both associated with some sort of moral inferiority if we're fat, and also the idea that that somehow it's linked to health and we have control over it. Both of it's just all myths. You can't tell somebody's health based on their body size. And so I really do think that's the next frontier. Also a focus on older women and ageism and women with disabilities. And I do a lot of work around sexual violence prevention as it affects all of these intersectionally marginalized women.
Yeah, so taking like a very, very specific focus and looking at the big picture of like how everything is affected within that. What is something that you learned that surprised you in all of that research?
I think the thing that surprises me the most, and maybe this is my focus on research and activism around sexual violence, is how much we as women internalize the burden of sexual violence, how much we both don't recognize it as sexual violence. We recognize it as something that's wrong. I have a lot of students who will come to me and say this thing happened, but they don't call it rape. And then when it's identified as rape or sexual assault, we really do go through this process where we try to determine our role in it and what we could have done better, right? What was I wearing? What did I say? What signals was I giving? So how much we have internalized something that we know to be fundamentally and profoundly wrong. And anyone who's experienced sexual violence, and it's not just women, it's disproportionately women, and men are 99% of perpetrators. So there's certainly a gender element here. I think it's important to note that, and also important to note that gender nonconforming people and trans folks face higher rates of sexual violence than anyone else. But I think it's remarkable that women know that we shouldn't have to experience this, but we still take on so much of the shame and the stigma and the burden of preventing it. And we don't do this with any other violent crime, because it's some fundamental level. I think that gender-based violence is a way to maintain the existing gender social order. And so we accept and we normalize a lot of the practices that go along with that. So for example, women are supposed to be sexual gatekeepers and men are supposed to be sexual pushers, right? And so we set it up where consent is always, it's often hazy because of the gender norms when it comes to interacting, whether it's a hookup or a relationship. And so, yeah, it's surprising to me how much women internalize this. But then again, perhaps it shouldn't be surprising given that, rape and sexual assault, these are the only crimes where we put the victim on trial.
Right. Yeah, the cause and effect of how our society is structured.
Yeah, it's really well put, Whitney. And it's this, we structure society through our institutions, our norms, our practices, our laws, and then it plays out on an individual level that's quite shocking.
Yeah.
Shocking in the sense that we know we don't deserve it, and yet we're still taking on that responsibility. And I will say, so I go to a lot of trials to support survivors with an organization called Stand With Survivors. And we were recently at the Danny Masterson trial, and he is a member of Scientology. And Scientology, as you're pointing out, the structures here, Scientology had these young women whom he had raped go through classes where they had to determine their role in causing the rape. And you don't often get it that obvious or that blatant, but I think that sort of thing happens to a greater or lesser degree across institutions throughout the United States.
Yeah. Wow. So you've been studying these subjects for years now, a while. Have you witnessed changes within this, and where do you see it going in the near future?
That's a great question. I often get bogged down in thinking that nothing has shifted, nothing has changed, but of course it absolutely has. And I think it's important to recognize, the women who were the front line. We're talking about the second wave of the feminist movement, and just an asterisk on that. Most of the major leaders and thinkers of that movement were women of color. So when we label it as just a white woman's movement, because the press covered it that way, we're actually missing much of the activism of the movement. And so just looking at, someone like Betty Friedan or Angela Davis, right, doing this incredible work on down the line, Audre Lorde, writers, activists, a lot has shifted since then. So if we think of this in terms of progress, socially, politically, and economically, socially, I think women have taken 2 steps forward and 1 step back by embracing sexual objectification as being empowering, which is the subject of my new book. Politically, we are making inroads. We're now at representation 25% in the Congress, which, we're 51% of the population, but that's gone up tremendously in the past half a century. Economically, even though, we still have a massive wage gap, and certainly women of color have a bigger wage gap than white women, we are closing that wage gap. Progress is very slow, but women have moved into professions. Women are the majority of students undergraduate for many degrees now. We've had about 50% of women enrolled, or 50% of college students who are enrolled are women starting in 1984. So we're definitely seeing some progress. Rates of sexual violence remain high. I think there are a lot of, the wage gap is closing very slowly. There's a lot of sexual harassment in the workplace. There are a lot of experiences that we have as women that remind us that we're second-class citizens. And if you're a woman of color, a disabled woman, or fat woman, or an older woman, you're a 3rd or 4th or 5th-class citizen, depending upon how, those intersections really layer on top of one another. But I will say that we've definitely made progress. And I think that because we have the memory of a goldfish, because, social media has, of course, made this worse. I love social media, but we really don't know history. Young people haven't known history for a long time in our country. And with social media, there's actually no kind of impetus to even be connected to previous generations or to know what has gone before. But I think it's important for young feminists to keep in mind that this battle has been going on for a really long time. We are still in the fight, but much progress has been made.
So your book, The Sexy Lie, was there something specifically that inspired you to write this book?
That's a great question. So many great questions, Whitney Ann. So The Sexy Lie, the War on Women's Bodies and How to Fight Back, is a project that is, not kidding, 20 years in the making. So I started writing and publishing on this subject as a cub academic in the early 2000s. And the motivation for writing the book was a gift from my no media homeschooling upbringing, because when I was finally exposed to popular culture, the images of what people were saying were empowering for women were jarringly not empowering. And I'm not talking about from a prudish perspective or, cover up or that sort of the slut shaming. Specifically, I'm talking about the idea that The second wave of the feminist movement brought with it this sexual revolution, which very quickly got taken over by marketers and corporations and then sold back to women as empowering. But at the end of the day, being a sex object is just theoretically and empirically not empowering. So theoretically, it's not empowering because we simplify the world in our thinking. Humans have to, in order to approach the world in a way that is digestible. And the dichotomy at play with sex objects is the subject-object dichotomy. So to make it simple, subjects act and objects are acted upon. So even if you are the most valuable sex object in a culture that tells little girls that is what our value is, even if you're the most valuable sex object, you're still in a position that is inferior or subordinate to sexual subjects. Men get to be sexual subjects. They get to be the choosers, the validators of other men, the validators of women and their worth. And when you think about how we validate men, we raise them to view their bodies as these tools to master their environment, as Sarah Mernon put it, whereas we raise little girls to view their bodies as these projects that are never done, that are never good enough, and constantly have to be worked on. And this is where marketers come in, right? Because the bigger the gap between where we think our body is and where we think our body needs to be, the more products we'll buy. So they present to us impossible standards of beauty, of thinness, that are constantly appearing all over the place in thousands of ads. And so what has happened is marketers are driving this idea that women need to be sex objects because it makes them money. And we really need to break out of that, because that's the theoretical side of why it's not empowering, and was very obviously not empowering to me as someone who was coming into media with fresh eyes as a teen. But there's also so much empirical data that it's not empowering. We know that the more girls and women view themselves as sex objects, the lower their self-esteem. They're more likely to have an eating disorder. The higher their rates of body shame, the lower their aspirations and ambitions, the lower their confidence, the lower their desire to be in a leadership position. So believing the cultural script that we are supposed to be sexy and that's how we get power is fundamentally damaging to girls and women. And so, I felt a deep desire to get that information out into the world. And when I did, it was a new thing, which was surprising to me. I just figured a lot of people were writing about it. But you actually have to go back to the 1970s and radical feminists to find people making these critiques. And what happened between the radical feminist critiques of the 1970s and when I started really focusing on this in the early 2000s, what happened is corporations just convinced women, using mostly celebrities who didn't have a lot of power early on in their careers, as tools to promote this lie. And so I did a TED Talk in...
It was marvelous, actually. I was going to bring it up, but you are, so go ahead.
Well, and that's where I realized there's such a hunger for it.
Yeah.
And then I went through the juggernaut of the big time publishing process and mostly heard, I don't want to be talking about depression and eating disorders and sexual violence. And I do make the argument in the book that the first step in violence toward a group is dehumanizing it. And what is sexual objectification? It's the process of turning a human being into an object. So the widespread, normalized, expected sexual objectification of women is the first step in violence against us because it's dehumanizing.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about the novel Lolita and how it's very clearly about child abuse and pedophilia, and how that term Lolita has now been glamorized and women are now using it almost like a badge of honor.
Lolita, the book, is troubling because that's certainly how I read it and you read it. I think there are a lot of people, especially men, who are reading it as the glamorization of control, power, and dominance over a child. The film certainly glamorized it. And the fact that girls and young women are embracing this now is an attempt to maximize their status as a sex object, even though, as I pointed out, you're ultimately always giving your power away to somebody else who's validating you if that's your standard for value. And I shouldn't I should take a step back and say, I'm not blaming girls and women at all. We're born into this system. By the way, it's a system that's always, it's a game that's always stacked against us, because you will constantly try to be the most perfect sex object in order to get the most heterosexual attention, in order to validate your worth and existence on this planet. And you'll spend the amount of time that it takes to get 3 PhDs over the course of your lifetime doing all of this ridiculous habitual body monitoring, where we're thinking about our bodies, constantly working on improving hair, makeup, etc. And I'm not saying move away from that entirely. I think there's a lot of joy to be found in makeup. I wish men could find that joy too. But at the end of the day, we spend a lot of our time chasing something that ultimately we're going to age out of. And it's a fascinating kind of experiment too with young women who think they're never going to age. They're never going to get old, and it inspires intergenerational conflict between mothers and daughters, and between younger women and older women, and the erasure of middle-aged and older women, which is just profoundly sad to me. It actually harms female friendships. And so all of this to say that it's really hard to kind of expose it and reveal it, but the Lolita theme that you're talking about has everything to do with celebrating kind of male dominance over girls. That is what that is. And I think it's also, of course, a horrifying celebration of pedophilia.
Yeah, I agree.
And the fact that it's like high art, the fact that that's how dominance over teen girls gets normalized and celebrated in our culture through the vehicle of high art should be, sound some alarm bells for folks who care about the status of girls and women in our culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And young women. And I would never want to be like growing up as a young woman right now with all of the social media and pressures, like on top of all of these things as well. So what are your opinions on this, and how can we perhaps come to a better structure or solution? So
I just published The Sexy Lie, as I mentioned, after 20 years. And the reason that it took so long to finally publish it after the viral TEDx video and other articles that were really well received. So I knew there was a hunger. All of this to say, not to pat myself on the back, which is fine for women to do, but that's not why I'm saying this. But I knew there was a hunger. Everywhere I go, women want to talk to me about this. The reason I waited, though, was because the social media landscape was shifting so radically that every time I would have a new draft, it would be outdated. And I finally just had to give up because, as you're pointing out, social media has taken everything that girls and women have experienced for a long time in a consumerist society that makes money off of their body dissatisfaction and put it on steroids. So yes, we now have, this kind of bifurcated self where you are a young woman with all of the pressures of being sexy and hot and thin, and you're a different person online than you are in real life. But of course, who you are online and whether you get validation for that has profound effects on your well-being, your depression, ideas about yourself in the real world. And so it is not surprising to me that we are witnessing a teen mental health crisis. Certainly it's being driven by the actual mechanics of social media. We have research on this, so we know that with the advent of and widespread adoption of social media by young people in 2012, starting in 2012, over the course of the decade, what we've seen is a decline in real life relationships, which has an effect on your mental health. Also a decline in the average number of hours you sleep, which is a primary driver, for example, of suicidal ideation, but certainly well-being overall. But I would go beyond that and say, it's not just the mechanism of it, it's also the content that folks are being exposed to. So girls are being, pressured with impossible images of being both a sex object and being, incredibly thin and airbrushed. And boys are being really pushed with these ideas, these artificial false ideas of traditional masculinity, which is, of course, so fragile that you constantly have to be proving it. But these notions that of the man box, that boys have to be in control, they have to be in charge, they can't have any emotions. In fact, I write and think a lot about how we create the man box in ways that are so damaging to boys and men. And it's not organic, right? We create the man box by telling boys to be everything that girls are not, to reject the feminine, to not cry, to not throw like a girl, don't show your emotions. And then somehow we raise, 49% of our population to build their core identity around rejecting everything that we're teaching the other 51% that they need to be. And somehow we scratch our heads when they don't respect women or don't fundamentally see women as full human beings. And I think that is a fact that runs way deep that we don't talk about. I think it's scary for women to acknowledge that. But boys and girls and gender nonconforming folks are getting terrible messages through social media that put more pressure on them than any previous generation. We beta tested this technology on children, and now we are seeing the results of that. And we as adult humans who put this technology into the world without properly, doing our due diligence to see how it would affect them, shame on us. Also, we can immediately shift that, right, by more thoughtful ideas about what folks are being exposed to through media literacy, through putting on your armor and going out into the world every day and understanding how these images are affecting us. And I think it's important too to keep in mind that if we didn't live in a world that sexually objectified girls and women, we would probably have a lot more sex and a lot better sex, because there's a huge difference between being a sex object whose sexuality exists for others and being a sexual subject whose sexuality exists for yourself. So being sexual and being sexy are not the same thing. In fact, I would argue that being sexy gets in the way of being sexual, mostly because of something called spectatoring. When you get into a sex act and your ideas about pleasure are constantly being interrupted by thoughts about, thigh fat and, oh, does my boob flopping over here look terrible? I mean, we're constantly monitoring our bodies all day long, girls and women are, in a way that's always surprising to, my male students. But also, especially when we get into sex, we start really thinking about what our body looks like for our partner or partners, and it gets in the way of sexual pleasure. So yeah, being a sex object actually is 2 thumbs down when it comes to having great sex.
Yeah. I was going to bring that up because that stuck out to me in your TED Talk when you were speaking about pleasure. And when it seems to be correlated specifically with social media and connection, with human connection, it seems like the pleasure of connecting with a human actually has been replaced with a dopamine hit of a like.
That's a great observation, Whitney Ann. And it's an addiction model, right? So we know that both porn and social media companies are deeply invested in the addiction model where they ramp up the content, which is why you see social media posts that involve conflict and debate will get more views, and they'll push those further because it keeps you hooked. And in porn, we actually see the escalation of violent acts and degrading acts in order to keep you addicted and take it to the next level of addiction. It's the same model that video games use. And so it's really troubling to see all of this power in the hands of a small number of companies that are dictating our sexual lives, our social lives. And Gail Dines has written a fantastic book called Pornland, in which she talks about how pornographers have essentially hijacked the sexual pleasure of young millennials and now Gen Z and Gen Alpha, where they're having less sex and they're having less pleasurable sex, but they're consuming more porn than ever. And that's the dopamine hit, which is not an IRL experience, which can elevate the human soul.
And actually causes physical dysfunction too among men as well.
It does. Much higher rates of erectile dysfunction and other forms of sexual dysfunction for men. And for women, if you're watching porn, because I've done porn research, you're not learning where the clitoris is, and just want to put a PSA out that that's actually the site of orgasm. So as much as you're being told it's all of these other orifices and holes, which is great in sex, I don't know how explicit we can get here, but
well, as far as you want to, it's all fine.
Well, I just think it's fascinating that if you watch porn, you wouldn't know that the clitoris, by and large, unless you're watching feminist lesbian porn, you wouldn't know that the clitoris is the site of orgasm for women or for folks with a vagina and a vulva, right? And we're told that there's a G-spot and all. Sure, there's all sorts of pleasure points, but the actual site of orgasm is the clitoris. And a lot of young people and a lot of middle-aged people and a lot of old people don't know this. And the corollary for me with men, the site of their orgasm is their penis, right? That is their site of orgasm. But imagine we ran all of this, basically a campaign trying to convince men that their inner thigh was their site of orgasm. That is what we have done with women. We have convinced them that it's interior. And the reason for this, Ann Coate wrote a great piece on this in friggin' 1970, but there's a long history of this, that the heteronormativity, right, of penetrative sex, of having a penis in the vagina. So if the site of orgasm is the clitoris and it's on the outside of the body, you don't actually need penetrative sex in order to have an orgasm. Penetrative sex can be really cool and fun. Nothing against that in any way, shape, or form. But let's be real here. Why is it that we don't know where the site of women's pleasure is? It's because so much of porn and the way we talk about women's sexual pleasure revolves around heterosexual male pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Just a side PSA, Whitney Ann. I want people to have better sex. I want them to have more sex. I want women to have orgasms. And it's irritating to me that cultural constraints are in the way of women having great sex.
Right. So pleasure seems to be a piece that we need to get back to, and which could probably empower women to not be so objectified in some way.
That's a great point, Whitney. And yes, centering our own pleasure would require a sea shift in the way we think. Because so much, if you're a heterosexual woman, your notions about what brings you pleasure likely revolve around men. It's fascinating to look at the orgasm gap, right? It's about 2 to 1 with heterosexual hookups. You know who's having an orgasm almost 100% of the time they're having sexual activity? Lesbians. It tells you everything you need to know about, what's happening in the world of sex and cultural scripts.
Yeah. So is there a overall message that you would love to share with people about the Sexy Lie and your book, and where they can find you and your work and what you're doing within the world, and how they can subscribe to you and just be a part of everything that you're doing?
The overall theme of the Sexy Lie is that if you're a girl or woman, you've been born into a culture that does not have your best interests in mind. And if you buy into the notion that your value is your body and how valuable of a sex object you can be, that it has really detrimental effects. And I think it doesn't take much to convince girls and women of this. All I'm doing is just naming the experiences that we have that are really negative. That's what I'm doing, just giving you the language. But I think the bigger point of the book is that we don't have to take it lying down, right? That we can't shift this culture, probably because it's patriarchy plus capitalism, and those are 2 really big systems, but we can navigate it in a way that is humanizing for us. We can recognize it, we can limit its damage. And so it's really a book of empowerment to say, here's what it is, this is why it's a problem, this is who's pitching it to you and why, this is who's making money off of it, this is how it affects you, terrible effects. And that's the chapter that a lot of women have written to me about and said, oh, I connected with this. And then here are all the tools to get around it. Here are all the tools to navigate it. You can't not wear makeup because you're seen as less professional in professional settings. So don't shoot yourself in the foot by wearing no makeup, but you should know that if you're sexually objectified in the workplace, the only women that doesn't affect are secretaries. So if you are in a position of middle management or in a position of authority, and you dress in a way that promotes a sexual objectification, that it will be held against you. And all of this is not about slut shaming. All of this is to say the system is broken. This is how you navigate it. And I strongly believe that you can't navigate it if you don't understand the problem. And I don't think you can just go cold turkey and leave the culture. I don't think that's the way to do it. So it's really an empowering book about all the tools, and you'll need to build your armor and then go out and fight it. And I do have all sorts of ideas of what you can do at the individual level, of what you can do in your family, your community, and then what you can do kind of at a structural level with media companies, with political parties, with political leaders and laws and legislation. So a lot of kind of, let's do this, ladies, and not in a way that's patronizing, right? And not in a way that says, oh, we can just change the world. I actually say, you know what, we can't. So let's change this little piece right here and let's make our lives better. So you can order the Sexy Lie. All of the proceeds are going to anti-sexual violence nonprofit. So if you just Google it, my website is drcarolineheldman.com. I, as I mentioned, am a professor and I publish on different subjects, but this is definitely my passion, is helping girls and women navigate a world that asks them to be dehumanized second-class citizens. Also, if you need any assistance with rape survivorship and moving through that, I work a lot with folks who are going to go public and try to really help them put on, to use the term again, help them put on armor for what comes next as a public survivor of rape or sexual assault. And all of my social media handles are at Caroline Heldman. Please get off Twitter. I'm trying to make the move over to Threads. And as we're recording this, Threads has 30 million folks, which is really exciting. And I only say this because I think Mark Zuckerberg is a slightly less offensive dude bro than Elon Musk. And I want to live in a world where we don't elevate either of the archetypes that those men are.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for following your passion and offering this to the world. I think it's super important and relevant at this moment in time. And I will add all of the show links into the notes so that people can find you easily and effortlessly.
Thank you so much, Whitney Ann, for using your platform and your voice to elevate ideas and help people work through the struggles in their lives. Really wonderful.
So I have one last question to wrap up that I usually ask. And this question is, if your inner voice had a billboard, what would it say to the world?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not going to have a political career, so I actually get to say whatever I want. My inner voice is pretty much a honey badger, Whitney Ann. Honey badger, right?
Yeah.
Don't give a fuck. If there was one thing I could impart to young women, is you're going to waste years of your life caring about what other people think of you, and have that shape you. Your time, your energy, everything goes toward that. And that, yeah, it's just not giving a fuck about what other people think about your body, or your loud voice, or your loud hair, whatever's happening in your life. Really decide who you are instead of letting the world, pinball machine you around for a couple decades.
Yeah. Don't waste your time.
Yes. Oh, that's a much more polite way of saying it, Whitney Ann. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me this week. If you're listening and you like what you hear, please consider subscribing and rating this podcast, as it really helps get this podcast out to other people who might be interested in hearing it but don't know about it yet. And also, if you'd like to contact me or reach me, you can reach me at unconditioningpodcast@gmail.com or unconditioningpodcast on Instagram. Thank you so much. And until next time, stay tuned in to you.